We remember the Vikings as fearless raiders, masters of the sword and sea. But history rarely whispers about what happened after the battles ended, after the final prayers of dying monks faded into the air, and the smoke from burning chapels stained the dawn sky. The true horror began. Not for the fallen warriors whose torment was over, but for the nuns who remained. Women who had sworn their lives to God now faced a nightmare that made death seem merciful. You think you know Viking brutality? The ancient sagas themselves fall silent on what came next. This story draws from the writings of Ibn Fedland and archaeological discoveries at Dublin's slave markets. Let's travel back to the year 845. The monastery at Clonmacnoise falls to Thorgest and his fleet. 43 monks die defending the altar. The chronicler records the slaughter, and then his ink stops. He never writes what became of the nuns. But archaeology speaks for him. Excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay revealed the infrastructure of Viking slave markets, iron shackles, sized for slender wrists, ankle rings no larger than a child's, and warehouse foundations built to confine the living. The Dublin Vikings didn't just raid for gold and relics. They raided for flesh. A captured nun had value not as a servant of God, but as inventory. Runic inscriptions from Schleswig show price carvings in stone. 20 silver pieces for a young nun, 15 for an older sister, 10 if she was wounded during the raid. These were receipts carved in stone. But here is what the sagas won't tell you. Being sold was often the merciful outcome. In 862, Vikings sacked the monastery at Portmar. Irish annals record 47 warriors dead, and then silence. No mention of the nuns taken from the cloisters. But soil samples from nearby bogs reveal another truth. 23 female bodies, all showing the same brutal signs: blunt trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on their arms, shattered ribs from prolonged assault. These weren't battle deaths. They were ritualized killings, methodical, repeated. Carbon dating places the deaths within days of the raid. They died after surrender, after captivity, once their fate had been decided. And the Vikings always made the same decision. Their war culture had laws, savage ones. A defeated man's wife or a nun under his protection became the property of her captor, not as a servant but as his woman. The Old Norse called it kona, an owned woman, property that breeds. The Icelandic Gragas law codes describe the process. The captor declares ownership before witnesses. The woman's will means nothing. The act is legal. The children born from it are legitimate, though conceived in violence. But even this twisted version of marriage was not the worst fate. Viking custom demanded human sacrifice, the killing of women as part of a warrior's send-off. Ibn Fedland himself witnessed such a ritual on the Volga in 921. A slave girl, raped, drugged and strangled to accompany her master to the afterlife. He saw it once. Archaeology proves it happened countless times. Analysis of Scandinavian boat burials shows the same pattern. Female skeletons with marks of strangulation and traces of henbane and other hallucinogenic plants in their teeth, drugs meant to dull fear and force compliance. They died seeing visions. Perhaps they thought it was divine light. Perhaps it was something far darker. By the time the great army wintered at Thetford, chronicles list cattle stolen and churches burned. But nothing of the nuns who were taken. Yet the midden heaps near the site tell another story. Among the refuse, archaeologists found infant bones, dozens of them, each showing signs of deliberate skull trauma. These weren't stillbirths. They were murders. Children born from Viking assaults upon nuns. Children neither faith nor father wanted to claim. Viking law was clear. If the mother was property, the child was property. If it could not serve, it did not live. The lucky ones died in childbirth. The rest vanished into the slave routes, north to Scandinavia, east toward the rivers of Rus, south into the markets of the Islamic world. Dublin wasn't just a port. It was a human processing center. Behind its whitewashed walls, the nuns of Christ were stripped of everything, even their names. 9th-century Arabic sources describe Viking slave caravans stretching from the Baltic all the way to Baghdad. Fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic nuns fetched the highest prices, treated as exotic treasures and symbols of status. The Vikings didn't just raid monasteries, they supplied a global trade in sanctity and suffering. But the worst fate was reserved for those who resisted. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin. The annals record the liberation, but not the horror discovered beyond the city walls. Excavations reveal execution pits, stone-lined holes built not for swift death, but for prolonged dying. Inside, archaeologists found skeletons showing deliberate trauma, legs broken to prevent escape, arms shattered to stop self-harm. The victims were kept alive while they died. Each pit was 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand. They perished in a crouch over days, sometimes weeks. The cruelty was calculated, a spectacle of suffering performed for those still alive to see. The message was clear: obedience or torment. But the worst fate was reserved for those who resisted. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin. The annals record the liberation, but not the horror discovered beyond the city walls. Excavations reveal execution pits, stone-lined holes built not for swift death, but for prolonged dying. Inside, archaeologists found skeletons showing deliberate trauma, legs broken to prevent escape, arms shattered to stop self-harm. The victims were kept alive while they died. Each pit was 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand. They perished in a crouch over days, sometimes weeks. The cruelty was calculated, a spectacle of suffering performed for those still alive to see. The message was clear: obedience or torment. This system of violence wasn't random savagery, it was commerce. By the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, Irish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms united to crush the Norse. They won decisively. But what they found in the Viking baggage trains defied belief. Portable breeding pens, iron frameworks for prisoners, chain assemblies small enough for children, mobile slave markets that moved with the army. The engineering was efficient, systematic, and horrifying. The captured nuns were not casualties of war. They were the prize itself, living resources to be processed and distributed. When Viking power finally collapsed in England, the evidence had to disappear. The witnesses were silenced. Excavations at Repton revealed a mass grave from 986 containing the remains of 236 individuals, all female, all showing signs of organized execution. Isotope analysis revealed they were Norse, not English. These were not prisoners. They were Viking nuns, women of faith living within Norse colonies, executed by their own people as English forces advanced. Fathers killed daughters. Abbots executed their own novices. They knew what awaited captured nuns, for they had inflicted it themselves. Among the remains was a skull carved with a runic inscription, Betra Esva. It is better this way. Someone carved the words after death, perhaps as a justification. The skull belonged to a girl of 12 or 14. A young nun born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and slain by her own kin to prevent her capture. Even in murder, the Vikings sought to rationalize their cruelty. The inscription made their logic eternal. Recent excavations in Jorvik, modern-day York, reveal the system's horrifying core. Beneath medieval rubble, archaeologists uncovered a structure unknown to any text. 64 individual cells cut into stone. This wasn't a prison. It was a breeding facility. Soil analysis shows continuous occupation for 40 years. Every occupant was a nun. Everyone endured multiple pregnancies, and all were discarded when they could no longer bear children. The building stood in the heart of the city. Everyone would have known. Church records from the nearby cathedral list the baptisms of 732, children born inside. Only 12 lived past the age of 5. The records call them foundlings, sold as servants. God's work was financed by systematic violation. The most devastating discovery comes again from Repton. Beneath the known mass grave, Archaeologists found deeper layers, multiple burial phases spanning 50 years. This wasn't a single massacre, it was generations of elimination. Chemical tests show traces of mercury compounds in the bones, deliberate poisoning. The toxin acted slowly, causing madness before death. The victims would have raved and screamed, their minds disintegrating long before their bodies failed. Under Viking law, testimony from a madwoman held no weight. Madness erased truth. So they were poisoned, not merely to die, but to be disbelieved. Their suffering became its own erasure. This is the history the records tried to bury. A story not of glory, but of a silent genocide. A system built on sacred suffering, where faith was commodified and bodies became currency. These forgotten voices have waited 1,000 years to be heard.